The historic material you are about to see has been preserved and distributed as a public service by Laclede Gas. 2,000 people taking care of more than 1 million customer inquiries, making more than 400,000 service calls, adding to 12,000 miles of pipe. Laclede Gas, bringing you energy that is comfortable, efficient, and virtually pollution-free.
Like many American cities, St. Louis has old sections that have been cleared as completely as if a bomb had dropped, as if the present were winning all the battles in a war against the past. The past is a grudging opponent, but it yields its ground eventually to renewal projects and redevelopment. And the handiwork of a generation vanishes without a trace. Yet the echoes of other generations are persistent in St. Louis. The past has a way of lingering here. Memories become long in a city almost 200 years old, and sometimes they turn the scraps of the past into legends that endure. Well, one of the liveliest of these dwells right here. It's as hardy a ghost as those that move among the cobblestones on the levee or under the arches of the Eads Bridge. It speaks of an elegant time in the city's life when St. Louis was younger and smaller, but still dominating the western part of the country. It was a time when all of this bare land here at Vandeventer and Enright was Vandeventer Place, a stretch of grand mansions crammed with imported woodwork and statuary and marble-top tables and pussy willows in vases, in an exuberant style the like of which existed nowhere else in the country to quite the same degree. Well, for the next hour, we're going to see St. Louis as it was when Vandeventer Place was alive. We'll see the St. Louis of the 1890s and the latter years of what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. We'll see the news events of that time. Its people rising to meet the worst natural disaster they ever experienced, playing host to a national political convention, heading into their first war on foreign soil since their grandfathers fought the Barbary pirates. We'll see them beginning to go places in a new vehicle of uncertain noises and uncertain behavior. Aboard the automobile, St. Louis rode into the 20th century, and within the space of a few years experienced the greatest changes of its long history. But in 1895, only 60-odd years ago, the space of a lifetime, great changes probably didn't seem either prospective or desirable. Up there at number 16, at the house of David Roland Francis, the solid gold chandelier in the dining room has impressed a recent weekend guest, President Cleveland. Over there at number 40, in the house of Mrs. H. Clay Pierce, or when Mrs. Pierce writes a letter, it passes through the hands of 17 servants before reaching the postman. On the other side of Vandeventer there, the city begins thinning out and soon becomes open farmland. And the fountain here, with its centerpiece statue of a boy with a swan, a fountain where Washington University's Chancellor Ethan Shepley remembers fishing for tadpoles as a boy. The fountain still sparkles in the sunshine.
C.H. Peck, a banker, built the first house, an Italian villa. Various kinds of gingerbread Gothic followed. They all had watchtowers and frowning windows as if to protect our privacy. On Mondays, it was the custom all over town for everyone to call on everyone else. That was the day we opened up the parlor. The ladies of my mother's Browning Society met here sometimes to play parcheesi. They favored the mysterious Oriental look in parlors then, and we had our Turkish corner, as it was called, with tambourines and cushions. In our century, many old monarchies had collapsed abroad, and unemployed European noblemen sold their household goods to dealers who sold them to us. Even if some of it came from Grand Rapids, we thought the effect was friendly and splendid. Our luxurious clutter of knickknacks suffered steady damage from our house full of growing children, one reason why the supply of genuine antiques has become short. Outdoors, the world was considerably less formal. In the alleys and stables and nearby farm ponds, there were as many animals as people. We learned to drive goat carts and pony rigs, and we graduated with pride to the family carriage and drives in Forest Park. On a fine day, the park's entrance at Lindell and Kings Highway was the rendezvous for hundreds of clubs, to some of which it seemed almost everyone in town belonged. But the park had beautiful, quiet places like the famous Pretty Birch Drive. Members of the bicycle club used to stop off here for solitude and courting. Their favorite meeting place was Schweighort's Cottage Restaurant for lunch. They were a dashing lot, the men and girls alike. Other clubs used the park for more genteel pursuits. It was the mark of a proper lady to paint and to learn that life is short and art long. The dashing and strenuous females took to the tennis club. Some people felt it was physically harmful for women to leap about. But 5 years later, Dwight Davis of St. Louis established the Davis Cup for international matches, and the sport became respectable. We were respectable even to wearing our best clothes when boating. All the streams around St. Louis were clear then and full of fish. And if you were out for a picnic, you could catch enough for your main course. In warm summers, the park was one enormous picnic. The women provided twice as much food as anyone could eat, and the park provided an ample supply of chiggers and ants. When the bites interfered with the courting, the principal purpose of every picnic, we moved in the early evening to the summer house in the backyard. There, among the moonflowers and trumpet vines, we sang the songs and said the words that brought marriages about and children and moves to other neighborhoods.
I got a job as coachman on arriving in St. Louis. I drove my gentleman downtown each morning. I was hired solely because of my accent, which the family thought added tone to the horse and carriage. But I learned to recognize every neighbor by the silhouette of his rig, and the horses knew the road downtown so well, I could spend my time looking at the people and what was going on. The stores on the outskirts were mainly for neighboring farmers who were still allowed to drive their herds of cattle through the town on the way to the stockyards at East St. Louis. All this and the wagons of the tradesmen stirred up a crashing amount of dust in the afternoon, but of a morning, after the sprinkling wagons had been out, the air was sweet with the smell of wet dust. Everyone wanted the city to sprinkle more, and this was a noisy issue at City Hall. As we approached Grand and Olive, there were always people around Garage's famous market to give me a friendly hello. Sometimes I swung north from here to let my horse drink at the old water tower. As stores and traffic thickened, I had to go along carefully. There were packs of urchins in the gloom who would lie in wait to frighten my horses. I kept my eye peeled. But our trip to downtown was quiet enough, and I looked up Olive Street from 4th to find the urchins and everyone else entirely occupied with other matters.
We've got to get to the fairgrounds, the St. Louis Fairgrounds, by 2 p.m. 2 p.m. the show starts, the big show. Don't touch the elephants, mister. See 'em up close at the fairground. Don't feed the elephant that apple, Sonny. He can't digest it, and he'll get sore. Look at 'em gander, Harry. We'll make up for that rain in Springfield. It's a good show town, Harry, old St. Lou. We always done good here. Clear a path, folks, clear a path. We've got to get to the fairgrounds, the St. Louis Fairgrounds, by 2 p.m.
That's a lion.
Don't fall the lady's hat, Sonny. You bet the lion has real teeth, gents. Come out to them fairgrounds and stick your hand in his cage. We'll break records here, Harry. Harry, don't let the hands get into the saloon till we got the tent up. And keep that shell game out of sight till I talk to some of the people around here. Clear a path, folks, clear a path. We've got to get to the fairgrounds, the St. Louis Fairgrounds, by 2 p.m.
The Gilded Years were not all gilded. They also were the years of the rough river wards and Kerry Patch. There, among the stable yards and saloons, there was the 12-hour day, tough machine politics, child labor, almost no plumbing, and life went on with few changes since the Civil War.
When I practiced medicine down there as a young man, living was cheap, but life was cheaper. You could eat 3 meals for a quarter a day, but there were plenty who didn't have the quarter, and the markets swarmed with beggars and hungry thieves. I had cases of malnutrition when my clients didn't eat, and cases of ptomaine when they did. I had 20 cases of typhoid in 1894. To offer solace, there was a saloon for every 100 persons, according to the Ladies' Aid, which collected statistics when the ladies could get up the courage to go down there. About half the children finished the 8th grade. 21,000 of them were illiterate. 10,000 worked in factories. The rest sat and stared from the alleys and wandered in packs among the garbage cans. They could look forward to an occasional free meal in the poorhouse or soup kitchen when they grew up. In this somber decay, I saw St. Louis as a city sitting motionless, hypnotized by its grand past, but restless and uneasy with unsolved problems. I could not know that many of these slums would be cleared in an afternoon.
They eventually counted 400 dead, 1,200 injured. It seemed almost everyone in town had a relative or friend or fellow worker living in the path of the great tornado of 1896. The survivors spent weeks waiting and searching. The force with which the tornado tore 5-foot stone blocks from the Eads Bridge and wrecked the waterfront was a fraction of its energy. It cut a path of almost total destruction from the poorhouse on the city's western outskirts, through Tower Grove Park and Shaw's Gardens, across the river and into East St. Louis. It had seemed to pause when it reached the bridge and scattered some of the masonry far across the river. The time, 5 o'clock in the afternoon of May 27th, 1896, was a few minutes after the Chicago and Alton's Fast No. 7 left the station on schedule. The tornado scattered the industries along the waterfront. The wrecked factory of Liggett and Myers became an emergency hospital. Profits and payrolls stopped for months. Thousands of men were out of work. The tornado paralyzed the street railways. It delivered a final blow to the few remaining horse cars. And at the cable car powerhouse of the People's Railroad Company at 18th and Clark, the wheels that pulled the cable cars through the streets were twisted on their axles, and most of the cable had to be laid again. The tornado laid a heavy hand on the churches. The Lafayette Park Presbyterian Church on Missouri Avenue, the Mount Calvary Church, the Methodist Church at Lafayette in Missouri. Its wide zigzag path paralleled the south edge of the Mill Creek Valley before turning at Lafayette Park. At this time, the park was a city showplace of elaborate flower beds. The statue of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, which still stands there, now contemplated a park that left members of the flower clubs as numb as he was. For years, the park had been their open-air meeting place, a favorite spot to show with pride to out-of-town friends, the centerpiece of one of St. Louis's most fashionable neighborhoods. Around the park were some of the city's most beautiful residences. They were now among a total of 8,000 homes destroyed, with $50 million of damage. The newspapers reported that for the space of 2 or 3 days, the owners sat and stared about them. But a day came when movement began again, and work and planning. Among the thousands of sightseers were hundreds willing to help. The horse car and cable car operators organized a battalion of volunteer helpers. Women led their families back into the wreckage to haul away the rubble and build the homes again. It was the worst tornado ever to hit a major city, a national disaster. And its work became finally a pile of debris on the riverbank. In it was a part of the old 19th century town. What was left turned toward a new job of rebuilding and a new century. Great tornado struck St. Louis just a month before the Republican Party was to hold a convention here to choose its presidential candidate for 1896. Well, a Republican Arrangements Committee came down to look over the wreckage and suggested that it might be better to move the convention to Chicago. That speeded up the job of repair. St. Louis not only cleaned up the wreckage in time for the Republicans, it played host that same summer to conventions of the National Silver Party and the Populists as well. Now, we'd had conventions before. The Democrats nominated Tilden here in 1876 and Grover Cleveland in 1888. But this time was a time of troubles. A Wall Street panic 3 years earlier had launched a long depression. A ragged army of homeless led by Jacob Coxey had marched through the country on its way to protest in Washington. The Pullman strike had brought federal troops and shooting to Illinois. To the west and south, there was a political prairie fire. With farm prices far down and foreclosures threatening, farmers were waving pitchforks in the state capitals. They heard their fiery orators of the time, like Mary Elizabeth Lease, advise them to get out there and raise less corn and more hell. And William Jennings Bryan raised the battle cry for the free and unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16 to 1. Well, all of this the Republicans and Gold Democrats called hayseed socialism. They swore it pointed straight to national bankruptcy and a crisis as serious as a civil war. They had pretty well picked their candidate in advance of the convention. But the fact that the Silverites and the Populists were to meet here, too, in the weeks following, made them determined to give their man a rip-roaring send-off into what they regarded as a holy war for survival. Well, that summer, St. Louis, awakening to a sense of impending great changes and events, became for a while the political capital of the country.
I was a Bryan man myself that summer, but I took the week off to hang around the convention hall at 12th and Clark to watch the Republican politicians. Every hour they rang fire gongs and bells, shot off a brass cannon, had bands going by playing Union marching songs. That was for the Grand Army vote. There were still plenty ex-Confederates in St. Louis, but they were in their 50s and 60s then, and mostly for Bryan. But I never saw people so heated up as we were that summer over the money issue. None of us knew what it was all about. But you could start a fight on any street corner or saloon by yelling loud either gold or silver. Since the convention knew who it would nominate, the long speeches gradually made tickets easy to get, and finally drove out even the delegates to seek entertainment. Like all politicians, they were men who had no objections at all to having a good time. Having their wives along cramped their style some, but not much. There was always a committee meeting going, and I fell in with one committee from Kansas that decided Tennessee bourbon was a good color to paint the town. Tony Faust was where we called our committee to order after the races. Even the delegate from Clay Center had heard of Faust's at Broadway and M. Between 9th and 4th Streets, in an area 2 blocks wide, you could meet every evening all the prominent men of the city. At the Southern, the Planter's House at McTague's, or at Faust's Restaurant. The delegate from Willow Grove studied that menu for 20 minutes. The prices are terribly high, but the chef is from Europe. Makes almost $5,000 a year. In those fancy surroundings, my Kansas friends were quiet, but they were dead game. Without batting an eye, the delegate from Dodge City picked up a check for $8 for 6 of us and kept it to show the boys back home. In St. Louis, you followed a dinner at Faust's with an evening at the theater. The most famous of the old theaters was the Olympic on Broadway, right across the street from Faust's. You could hear the actors sometimes all the way down the block. The drama was nothing if not dramatic. Joe Jefferson spent months here, sometimes in Rip Van
I
Winkle.
must be torn from thee. We must part, we must. My
But it
son
was
and
the
I
ladies that interested my Kansas committee.
upon a moment. One kiss and then be gone. Farewell.
They were impressed by John Drew.
So riveted to thine that I cannot unloose my hold.
But to the Kansas boys, the actors were just men after all.
Go.
The ladies
for till
were
death.
actresses.
Holly is wretched.
I suggested a burlesque show, and not a voice was raised in protest. We went to pose, and they preferred the discreet side entrance. When they saw the posters in the lobby, I couldn't interest them in the fact that Frank James, the old bank bandit and brother of Jesse, was doorman here. They stayed glued to their seats. There was nothing quite like this back home in Willow Grove. Next morning, the Republicans nominated McKinley on the first ballot. He'd been a brigadier general in the Civil War, but a year or so later, he wept when he signed the declaration of war against Spain.
From a sleepy army post south of St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks became a great tent city when the president called for volunteers to fight Spain for a free Cuba. The first time the war drums had rolled in almost 40 years, except for fights against the Indians. The soldiers dressed like old Union Army troops, some like Confederates. Some had no uniforms at all as the Army struggled with the problem of supply. My brother and all his friends volunteered. But war is also monotony, and they became lonely and bored, and sometimes sick from the bad food. It was the custom for families to drive down on Sundays to cheer them up and watch the parade. As in all wars, it was a time of hurried courting, and many of the ladies had matrimony as their purpose. We dreaded to see the camp life turn them into soldiers, but they were ready to fight and proudly demonstrated their weapons for us. I remember the parade with L Company, mostly Missouri boys. As great victories were won at Manila Bay and Santiago, the bands played briskly, and the men turned to with spit and polish. Thank heaven, they fire their guns only in salute for the victories of others and before the admiring eyes of the crowds from our city. Fortunately, just as they mobilized to leave, the war ended. And while a few had gone to Puerto Rico, most could come home with us. We had made permanent choices those Sunday afternoons. We visiting girls had been deeply impressed as usual by the cavalry. This was the last war of the horse soldier. Never had he seemed more gallant as he rode off to become a tradition and end his era.
At war's end, the changing times became a staple of conversation, like Missouri weather and politics. Except for an occasional excursion or packet boat, the levee was empty. The commercial heart of St. Louis now faced away from the river. It had moved up to the top of the bluff from 3rd Street West. There was a flurry of new construction. The Wainwright Building had been built at 7th and Chestnut. Designed by Louis Sullivan, it was to inspire a new approach to architecture. With all the building, people complained that the hammering and riveting made it difficult to manage a horse downtown. The city sprawled and spread as the last great wave of immigration crested. There were more people, moving in a thickening haze of smoke from new factories. One of these added a small amount of smoke, but a sizable volume to the growing level of city noise, at a time when Detroit was still a whistle stop between the lakes. It opened at 1211 North Vandeventer, Thanksgiving Day, 1898. Using hand tools, its workmen turned out a product that aroused sallies of wit among the town sports at Faust. But the chief engineer, Mr. George Doris, was sure people would want to buy it. He had handcrafted a similar product in 1895, long before Henry Ford drove another version along the dirt roads of Michigan. He had invested all his savings in this plant, and so had his trusting friends. The first model had one cylinder, it was powered by gasoline, and it ran. Mr. Doris cut his gears, coils, transmissions, differentials, axles, and wheels. In the body department, they used carpenter's tools to make the wooden frames. But with workmen from this plant, George Doris got his product on the market in 1899, only a few months after the Winton, America's first commercially made car. He called it the St. Louis. Because the St. Louis ran, it sold, and the staff expanded as the orders came in, some from as far as Texas, where the St. Louis was the first horseless vehicle to show up. And in the home office, as business increased, they hit upon a powerful slogan. The advertising copy was plain and direct, but it told a story of the conquest of time and space. The aim was to turn out one St. Louis a day. None of them looked quite alike, and Mr. Doris made some trucks as well with his associates, John and Jesse French. On the streets, they joined a growing number of strange homemade gas buggies. The motor vehicle attracted a junior following it was never to lose. Local physicians bought motors and attached them to buggies in their basements, hopeful that speeds of up to 8 miles per hour would enable them to make more daily calls. The sports at Faust still laughed, but the thing was multiplying, driven by hope, chains, and gas. The pioneer car of Dr. E.V. Dittlinger, homemade, cruised confidently. It cranked from the side, had a fringed top, and steered with a tiller. But he didn't hesitate to risk his family in it, and it ran. Others ran. They were balky, they were bumpy, but already they conferred a sense of distinction. With his motor carriage company, George Doris had launched a growing enterprise in an industry that showed signs of dominating the oncoming new century. It happens once every 100 years. The parties were the most lively in memory. Look back. We've acquired street lighting, the telephone, the wireless, the full dinner pail. Look ahead. Our children may see the brotherhood of man arrive. Salute it with heartfelt good wishes. Look back. We've ridden steel battleships to Cuba, Hawaii, the Philippines. Look ahead. The moon, the stars. Hoist a hopeful glass to boom times, peace, and a secure future.
Right away, the new century was greeted by a streetcar strike that turned loose some of the bloodiest riots St. Louis or any other town had ever seen. We used to collect streetcar tickets as kids. There were 13 separate car lines. When they merged into the United Railways, the operators struck. They feared a loss of jobs, and they did their best to make sure no cars would run on any tracks in town. While they were at it, they demanded 25 cents an hour, the 10-hour day, and recognition of the union, and announced they were prepared to fight it out on the street railway lines all summer. Despite all the new decorations on the streetcar tracks, it was peaceful enough at first. The men killed the long days and their Sunday best in the parks. 2,000 of them were idle. Looking out, they could see the town's 400,000 daily riders getting by with makeshift transportation. Then the company began trying to clear the tracks. Crowds collected along the routes. By now, there was hunger among strikers and their families. Hunger became anger, and angry men made their move. The strikers hung the operating foreman in effigy on the trolley wires, surrounded the effigy with trash, and promised to hang the real foreman if he carried out a threat to bring strikebreakers in from Mexico, Missouri, and nearby towns. It didn't look like the new century was quite ready for the brotherhood of man.
The first bloody riot at 18th and Washington killed 12 people. Guns were passed out to volunteers, some to veterans of the Civil War, and a reluctant militia. In subsequent clashes, 100 people were wounded by bullets, 200 others injured. The piles of trash on the tracks grew, and so did the bitterness on both sides. Samuel Gompers, the new president of the AFL, came to St. Louis to help find a settlement. But in the end, two St. Louisans worked out a compromise. Harry B. Hawes, later a U.S. Senator, and Joe Folk, later governor. They got the men back to work with their 25 cents an hour and their 10-hour day. And St. Louis got an indication that the new century would be as pesky and complicated as the old one had been. As the trolleys got back on the tracks, people could look out their streetcar windows and see an alternate method of moving from one place to another. Its use had increased during the strike. It threatened existing ways of doing things. It impudently took its place beside established transportation. It began to invade even Vandeventer Place and deposit its dust in the famous fountain with the boy and the swan. And as the auto came through the gates, there was a Trojan horse. But not even the Ouija board, so popular in the time, could have foreseen that result in 1900. The narrow gates of Vandeventer Place were made to admit passage of a coach and four, and they were never widened. Yet residents of Vandeventer Place did begin owning motor cars, as did everyone else in St. Louis. The first one here was bought by J.D. Wooster Lambert. The story is that it attracted a pack of excited dogs wherever it went. And the yapping of the dogs and the normal racket of its engines caused older residents a certain sense of disquiet. Yet by the time of the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, there was scarcely a place in town you could go to get away from the things. Shops for their care and feeding were multiplying along Olive from the 2300 block on west. In the next few years, some 23 different makes of motor cars were to be manufactured here. They were even penetrating far out in the country. Tales were told that some had been driven as far as Columbia, Missouri and back in a single day. There was talk of a drive to get Missouri and St. Louis out of the mud. Other matters with which the motor car has been embroiled ever since were beginning to be affected by its presence. Police, traffic, speed limits, clothes, women, recreation. The list was endless and it got longer. Well, all of this was becoming pretty evident by the time of the fair. In the 16 acres in the Palace of Transportation allotted for the motor car show, and in the long love affair which now began between the automobile and the citizen.
At the Palace of Transportation, they had more cars under one roof than any auto show since. About 100 American, 50 French, and even 2 German makes, powered by steam, batteries, and gas. The sight of them all created a powerful urge to buy. There are almost as many different cars on Lindell on Motor Car Road. A man might spend 6 months making up his mind. The old brand names arouse strong loyalties. To hang around the garages arguing about whether a Pope Toledo could outrun a Thomas became more popular than hanging around the saloon, a contribution by the auto to the cause of temperance. Any parked car acquired spectators. They might be afraid to touch it, but they wanted to look, and they inspected its working parts from bow to stern. The owner attracted envy and achieved dignity.
At 4135 Olive, F.G. Rohde made radiators. Joseph Kutz changed from making harnesses. Cabs appeared. A.L. Dyke organized the first auto supply house in America. Even women read his nationwide trade journal. There was talk that the wind would pull their hair out at speeds of 30 miles an hour, or that their beauty might be blighted by gas fumes. But they discovered they could drive too and rode on toward the vote. A journey in the park past the statue of Frank Blair became the clincher for salesmen closing a deal. They pointed to visiting dignitaries like William Jennings Bryan, traveling in safety and comfort. They pointed the way also to speed and adventure. To load extra horses under the hood of a motor car became the objective of a whole new race of sports, now described as joyriding madcaps, infatuated with the newfound pleasures of wheeling. The first signs were posted warning against excessive speeds, but mounted police could catch an offender only when his machine broke down. For the sizable police force in the park, the beginning of the long struggle with motorists was a vain and unhappy time. But George Doris designed a special St. Louis. It was called the Skidoo car, the first squad car in the nation. Now owners matched their machines in endurance climbs up Art Hill. On the dirt track of the old fairgrounds, they developed engines that could win in races against a horse. It was an achievement just to finish, but the crowds loved even the dust. The usual winner when he was in town was a national figure as familiar as the president himself, Barney Oldfield.
We also tried to improve the breed of cars with reliability runs. About 25 machines would start a minute apart from the St. Louis Club on Lindell to endure an 85-mile course through St. Louis County. In addition to the normal hazards of blowouts and broken chains, it was common to lose the road in dust and drive into a field. We also found a certain amount of hostility in the small towns where owners of horses often threatened to shoot us. It became proper etiquette to stop and help lead the horse by. While the landscape in the county was pretty and uncluttered then, we always encountered too many troubles to enjoy it for long. In those days, a driver needed stamina and determination. He needed also a shovel. He needed an extra pair of dry socks. We always carried a toolbox full of spare parts on the running board, a length of rope, and plenty of spare cash to pay the high towing charges exacted by farmers in revenge. We found our way eventually to the old Merrimack Highlands Hotel, about 15 miles west of the city and south of the road that became Highway 66. There we usually reassembled, compared damages, and stopped for lunch. It seemed far out in the country. Its rural neighbors had begun to look strange and old-fashioned to us. And we realized, with something of a shock, we were looking at ourselves as we had appeared only a few years before.
But the wave of change that rode with the automobile, transforming a generation, was reaching out. The old mud streets of the city had been a political issue year after year. But now came a time of road building, spurred on by a reform mayor, Rollo Wells, and the new automobile club representing the race of motorists. It was a time of civic and commercial energy with attacks on long-standing problems. Old downtown landmarks like the Methodist Episcopal Church stood waiting for the wrecker. But by 1909, there was a new city hospital, the first playground had been established, plus a juvenile court and probation system. In those years of boosting and enthusiasm, much of downtown as it stands today was built or planned. The change from horse-powered St. Louis to gas-powered St. Louis became one of the most dynamic times the city and its people ever experienced. A time for congratulation came with the 100th anniversary of the city's incorporation. Beginning October 3rd, 1909, and for a week, several 100,000 people moved from centennial ceremonies in the park to vast parades downtown. The dirigibles of Mr. Roy Nabensue overhead represented a glimpse of the future. Despite low water from the dry season, 4 torpedo boats came up the Mississippi from the Gulf to salute the Centennial with the traditional 21 guns. Every steamboat, tug, locomotive, and factory let loose with whistles to greet them. Thousands of visitors swarmed aboard. For a week, they were a St. Louis fleet, the armed force of a Mississippi seaport tied with trade to the remotest lands on earth. Now came perhaps the last great parade in which the mayor and civic dignitaries rode the course on blooded horses, or grandly tipped their hats from horse-drawn carriages. It was the last parade of the White Wings. Their banners affirmed their pride of craft, though their numbers had dwindled with the coming of the motor car. They marched proudly with their brooms at shoulder arms. Past the reviewing stand on 12th Street came the 100 marching bands. Some of the floats were the familiar tableaus of the city's past. But to the front was the theme of centennial times. St. Louis was 100 years old. On this important birthday, it seemed quite a reasonable expectation that wherever its people wanted to go, they'd get there. The burst of confidence and hope generated with the new century and reaching its climax in the centennial lingered in St. Louis. It had its occasional ups and downs through wars and depressions and occasional lapses into civic indifference and apathy. But the theme that St. Louis and its people could accomplish anything they really put their minds to and really wanted became a persistent one that came to the city's rescue on quite a few occasions since. Other aspects of the centennial years passed quickly. About 1910 or 1911 came the invention of the self-starter. Well, thenceforth, in the words of the time, anyone with a toe could drive. And the sports who raced each other up Art Hill turned to ballooning and airplanes for excitement. However, during the ensuing years, as many as 39 different makes of automobiles were manufactured in St. Louis, and some of them are firmly fixed in many memories and worth looking at again. A famous and sturdy craft manufactured until 1926. The Gardner continued to be manufactured in St. Louis until the 1930s, its line suggesting elegance and style. The Doris was produced at the rate of at least one a day until 1926. And its maker, Mr. George Doris, still vigorous, still drives one occasionally, a rebuilt version of the model with which he confounded the doubters in 1899. But though the Doris and its homegrown contemporaries are long gone, St. Louis is today one of the world's largest motor car manufacturing centers, with Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet all represented with major installations here. As for Vandeventer Place, the automobiles swept St. Louis around and beyond it, along with many fine old leather neighborhoods of the time. The last of the great houses were built here in the 1890s. The first to come down were wrecked in the 1920s. Their splendor lasted scarcely one lifetime, so hurried a transformation overtook the city. Beyond the gates, the wave of change, launched some 60-odd years ago, still thrusts and probes, multiplying the city's problems, but carrying it outward to new destinies.
We hope you enjoyed the historic material in this presentation, which was made available as a public service by Laclede Gas through its video lending library. Laclede Gas, where public service is our daily business. Laclede Gas, 2,000 people bringing you energy that is comfortable, efficient, and virtually pollution-free.